Looking good.
Okay. Thank you, Margie. I was telling Margie earlier that I just retired just before the Zoom era hit. And so this is the first time I've ever given a presentation on Zoom. And I find it much less personal than sitting in a room and giving a lecture or giving a talk, where I can see the reactions, et cetera, from people. But anyway, I'll proceed. And so what I did when we hit the 50th anniversary, I thought that it would be a good thing to start to take a look at what some of the data about the count data tell us about what we know about raptors. And so anyway, that is the theme of what I want to talk about. And I'll go to the next one. So first of all, I'm going to show the outline, so to speak, that I'll talk about is just a little bit of background about Hawk Ridge from the perspective of the counting, because the years that the various counts took place are very important in what I'll be presenting throughout this talk. What I decided to do, there are 14 species that we count on a regular basis that provide enough information. There are more species than 14 that we actually have identified at Hawk Ridge, but those are the 14 that we feel we have adequate data to actually say something about their population and especially about their trend and over time. And the other second thing I'm going to do, I'm going to bring in a little bit about, for those species that breed in the state of Minnesota, I want to also just kind of show some of the most recent results about the breeding season, results from the Minnesota Breeding Bird Atlas project as well. So it gives you a little bit of flavor of how that species is doing in the state of Minnesota, if it breeds here at all. And so I want to put in some context, the overall status. So when I show the trend for each of the species, then I'm going to try to just have basically, for most species, only 2 slides, one showing the trend and a summary. And then I want to talk about some of the reasons for a decrease or increase, or whether it's stable, some of the issues about that species. And I just wanted also, I started going through, I should really thank a lot of people, or say that I haven't done this by myself, but there have been a lot of people involved in my life, which I've listed here. And to do this, I always then, I wonder who I forgot. So if I forgot somebody, I apologize. But so these are some of the key individuals that, at least for me, regarding Hawk Ridge, that have been have been important people. And some of them go back quite a ways to Ole Finstead, Jack Hofsland, et cetera, Jan Green, who's been a colleague of mine for a long time, Marge Carr, Burnett Honaki, some of those people that I got to know when I started first going to Hawk Ridge in about 1972, which is kind of an interesting time. I spent a little time with Dave Evans and Bob Rosenfield up at the banding station, but I realized early on that they could see birds a lot better than I could, because I was nearsighted at that point. I've changed my vision, so I have my left eye now is for long distance. I had LASIK done on that eye, so I can actually see. I'll read with my right eye and see distance with my left, and it worked out pretty well for me. Anyway, the ones in bold here are some of my graduate students that I had in the past, that some of which worked on, most of which worked on raptors.
Right, because we don't want them in it. Right.
I don't know if that.
Folks, this is Margie. Yeah, I'm going to poke in here. Please make sure, folks, a number of you are not muted, and so we're getting background conversation in the presentation. Please make sure that you've muted your mic, and then Jerry doesn't have to have the back chatter. Thank you.
Just a brief history, and mostly about counts. 1937 was really sort of the start of it. That's the time was a sad time, because that was a time when birds were being shot up at Hawk Ridge. And there probably was times before that. But I think the most important thing here is the ones in red here from the standpoint of counts. There were some informal counts began in about 1951. Some interesting data that can come out of that, but it really wasn't until 1972. Well, first of all, it's 1972 was also coincided when the DDT use was banned in the United States. And I'll talk a little bit about that because it's a really important time and issue for raptors because of the major mortality that occurred for so many of those species at that time. But it's also interesting because the official raptor counts then in a very systematic way began in 1972. However, it's still fairly spotty in 1972 and 1973. And so most of us, in terms of analyzing the data, doesn't start until 1974. And some of the work that Bob Rosenfeld did early on really highlighted that you should use 1974 for some of these counts because that wouldn't become most consistent. And then 1991 is also a key time because that's when some of the raptor counts were expanded to include a substantial part of November and December. And for some of the late migrating species, that's really an important issue. So I'm going to talk about some trends that began in 1974 and some trends that began in 1991 for some of the other species, but they'll be quite clear in some of the slides. Then there are a couple other issues. In 2004 is one of the time when Dave Carman, who was a director at that time, asked me to become on the board of what then became the Hawk Ridge Bird Observatory and a 501c3 nonprofit organization. I was involved a bit up until that time, but raptors weren't necessarily the focus of my own work. And then in 2007, that's when we hired Janelle Long. And I wanted to point out in 2010, the new count platform was built. That's kind of a landmark time. There was a little bit of concern that the count could have changed a bit at that time because you could see a larger vista, if you will, up at Hawk Ridge, but we haven't analyzed that data very carefully yet. I just want to point out, we'll be talking about populations and what affects populations. And so I show this diagram because if you sat down with a piece of paper and just said, looked at how a population could grow without any mortality, you'd quickly find this sort of exponential change and increase in the population over time. And but this is just pointing out that there are many, many factors that go into mortality and tapering off the population so it reaches some sort of a equilibrium. It never really does that. It fluctuates over time anyway, and because of those factors. So that's what we're always trying to understand is what is affecting these populations over time, and what we might have to pay attention to in terms of management changes to be made by society. So when we look at the big picture of biological diversity, these are some of the big ones that stand out, and most of them are quite important for raptors as well. Climate change is a big issue. Obviously hearing a lot about it, but that is a big one. But habitat and landscape change, we've known things change. I'll show you a couple of examples of that in a bit. Invasive and exotic species are an issue. Pollution, and that becomes into the whole DDT thing, and also the organic chlorine compounds that are being used today. The PFAS is being discussed extensively. And then there's in the oceans overexploitation, but one thing that has affected raptors in a very big way is human persecution. There was a lot of shooting going on. I'll provide a couple of examples of that later on. Diseases aren't they have been an issue around for a long time. We're trying to understand that issue much better. And then also there's a whole variety that are very specific to birds. Predation, from cats, predation by other organisms, structures, windows, buildings, towers, turbines, etc. A variety of other issues that affect, are really specific to the bird world. And I just give, I love this example. I've given it many times when I give in talks, but it really highlights the changes that have occurred in Minnesota. Sometimes people aren't aware how major these were. Because one time we had about 31.5 million acres of forest in the state of Minnesota, and that today, that's somewhere around 16.3 million acres. I may be off by a bit, but about 50% have been converted to other land uses. Whereas the prairies also a major change. 99% have been converted primarily to agricultural land. Wetlands also have been major changes, 48%. This is just in Minnesota alone. Other places can be more, sometimes less, etc. But there have been very clearly changes over the past several hundred years in the state of Minnesota. And I just I decided to show one picture, even from 1970, looking at housing density, how that's changed over a relatively short period of time. But it coincides somewhat with the time frame that we'll be talking about today, the early 1970s to the current time. But one of the things, sometimes people haven't seen this particular diagram, but it's a figure that was measured in Britain about eggshell thinning in the peregrine falcon. And these data came from a study of museum specimens that were gathered. Here, starting from 1900, is the thickness of the eggshells that were in the museum from back to 1900 up till when DDT began being used in the environment in the between about 1944 and 1945, during that period of time. And is very solid evidence of how the eggshells began to thin at that point in time for the peregrine falcon, of the ones in the collection, should I say. So, and the issue with DDT was primarily an issue of disruption of the calcium metabolism in the bird with the ingestion of DDT. And DDT was used as an insecticide. I can remember even in the city street of seeing trucks going by and spreading a fog, at least in the 60s, and for the killing of insects, mosquitoes, etc., that were not wanted by the public. And the eggshell thinning affects birds when they laid an egg, and they sat on the egg and the eggs would break. That's a simple explanation of it. But that was disrupted, and nesting and reproduction decreased substantially for many of the birds, especially birds that ate fish, where the concentration of DDT and other kind of organochlorine compounds bioaccumulated in these organisms from the food sources. So that is a quick rundown of the story, but at least one of the more classic examples of how DDT affected eggshell thinning. Okay, so we'll get to the analysis here in a little bit. I can explain one other thing, a couple of the data, where it comes from. So if you went on the Hawk Ridge website, or it's archived in a place called by the Hawk Migration Association in North America, called Humana. But some clever scientists took that data and over recent years and developed what's called the Raptor Population Index, a peer-reviewed study by ornithologists. And it was developed to try to account for some of these populations at these migration counts over time by looking at effort, data quality, some weather-related effects, et cetera, in a very complicated statistical analysis, and developed this index so we could look at migration counts, not only at Hawk Ridge, but all across these the migration counts in hundreds of sites across North America that are being done today. And so I'm using the Raptor Population Index as opposed to the raw data from the hawk counts, because it's much better, gives us a much better analysis of the trends over time of these data. The second one I'm going to show you is some of the results of the Breeding Bird Atlas. By the way, I've shown the website, so if somebody wants to go look at it, you can pull up the same data that I've got from Hawk Ridge for each species. You can look at different counts in different places. So that data is publicly available. And we have the Minnesota Breeding Bird Atlas. I'm going to talk about just a little bit about that. We've analyzed it. There's a website available, developed in 2016, and that is also online that can be looked at. And I've been involved in finishing a book, working on it for at least somewhere like 5 to 7 years. I think it's finally going to be out this fall. It's been a long time coming. This is a book. The cover will look like that little insert you see there. And I've been working with Lee Fan Muller. She's the lead author on the book, along with Janet Green. We wrote this. It'll be about somewhere. I'm right in the middle of page proofs right now of the book. We're at about page 550, I think. It's going to be probably a bit over 600 pages, I'm guessing. Maybe longer, because it's a pretty big bibliography as well. So anyway, we're looking forward to that finally getting done. It's been it's something we've worked on for quite some time, but there's been long delays in publishing, peer review, a variety of parts of that whole publication process. One of the things I also want to point out, I'm going to show you probably some of the results for many of these raptors on the diagram on the left, which is the results from the Breeding Bird Atlas. But I also wanted to point out there are some biases in that. You'll notice for the American kestrel in the middle of the map on the left-hand side, there's a really high concentration of confirmed nest sites for American kestrel in the Brainerd area. And that, I want to point out that was a wonderful effort by those people, the bird ornithologists and the group living in the Brainerd area. Did an extensive amount of work, field work, to gather data. The trouble is it's a little bit biased because we look at the actual data where we think that the best habitat for American kestrel might be is shown on the right. And based on a modeling exercise to look at where is some of the primary habitat, where we find that based on the same data that's on the map to your left. So again, a fairly complicated modeling process, but where we looked at habitat, climate, and landscape context to make some of these models about where management might focus on, shall we say, the recovery of that. And this will be important later on, because this is really one of the important species that would come out of some of the counts that we've been doing at Hawk Ridge and across the country. Is that, I guess can't answer that. It's blocked off on my screen here, the Hawk Ridge raptor count, but this is just a quick look at the counts at Hawk Ridge over time from 1972 to 2012. So it's abbreviated in this particular diagram, but it shows how the increased effort in 1991 has increased the overall count for many of the species during that period of time when the count was expanded. That's why for some species, we increased that effort. But also as a time, some big counts of broadwing hawks occurred after the 1991 period. Okay, so now I'm going to get into the trends. Again, most of this is going to be just a quick summary. Again, these are for 29 years, so we didn't use the whole 50 years for these data because of the change in monitoring some of these late migrating species into November and December. And that makes a big difference in the way the data looks over that period of time. So let's start with a really nice example. One of one of the certainly major success stories in the country is the bald eagle. And here are the count data from Hawk Ridge from 1991 to 2019. So that period of time. I just point out two examples that the data for Hawk Ridge from pre-1991, the average number of bald eagles counted per year was about 100. Now the recent average, because this is a population index on the left-hand side, doesn't tell you how many actually were counted, but just it's an index of population. The later counts later counts at Hawk Ridge now have been exceeding 4,000 birds. So you can see just an amazing recovery of that. And anybody that sort of knows anything about birds that has been out has been it's just been fantastic to see how many eagles are out there today. So this is a highly significant population increase. I'll back up to one thing, and I'm only going through 2019, and that's because the Raptor Population Index people have only counted up to that point in time right now. So they're about 3 years behind, about 3 years behind right now in that analysis. But it is such a big effort that they'll probably wait a period of time to redo it, or at some point become automated, like the Breeding Bird Survey is. Although the Breeding Bird Survey is only, they're a few years behind as well. So why have bald eagles increased? And again, I'm not going to try to say everything about it, but I try to highlight for each of these species what are some of the most important factors that are involved in this population and the trend. So again, I would definitely a huge conservation success story of the recovery of this species. And certainly many of the excellent management decisions that are made on the ground. I can highlight John Matheson up in the Chippewa National Forest and some of the things he did in forest management to protect bald eagles. It was a wonderful way that he did it, and he educated lots of other people on how to provide privacy, et cetera, and protection for bald eagles. And especially the banning of DDT was also extremely important in the 1972 period. And so that was really important in the recovery of that species. So he had really historically population lows from 1930s to the 1970s. Human persecution was shooting, trapping of these birds was rampant at some point in time. There's also a time of big land use changes, and again, DDT being used. A couple of other things that are important. We had the Migratory Bird Act. This is something that's important for all birds. That was implemented or passed in 1918. In addition, Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act in 1940. Those are really important events, as well as education that was very important to recovery of those species. But also, even today, we still have to be concerned about lead poisoning. That's why there's a movement to try to get rid of lead and tackle lead from bullets, etc., and shotgun shells. Vehicle collisions, power lines. There's some improvement in power lines, but not every power line is safe for birds. And there's so there's an issue of continuing to be concerned in some ways, but really a tremendous recovery of bald eagles. I just want one other slide on the eagles. You can see how things have changed. Partners in Flight, which is a big organization trying to estimate populations and deal with conservation of so many birds, estimated very recently 200,000 breeding adults in US and Canada. But the US Fish and Wildlife Service recently came out with said there's at least 316,700 of them nesting alone in the 48 lower states. And if we show that even for the state of Minnesota, the blue dots on that map on the right are where the confirmed nesting of bald eagles are in the state from the Minnesota Breeding Bird Atlas. It's just outstanding. And I've read as far back as about the accounts of bald eagles back in as much as we can, but in the 1800s, and what T.S. Roberts summarized in the early 30s on that. And it's the current range is really unprecedented in the documented history of Minnesota. Certainly, we'd expect that the population was, but nobody's ever documented a distribution of this magnitude in the state of Minnesota. So it's really it's really fantastic. Okay, let's go to another buteo, the red-tailed hawk. Again, these first species will all be from the 1991 to 2019 period. This indicates actually a significant decline of the red-tailed hawk from the 1991 to 2019 period, and it's nearly significant from 2009 to 2019, but not a significant decline. I'll get to this also as a summary at the end. But my first comment, so the question is why red-tailed hawks declining. In my mind, the migration counts are not the best measure of estimating the trends for the species. We count a lot of them, but you'll see that later on that the Breeding Bird Survey actually does probably a little bit better job in monitoring the species, and they've shown that they think the red-tailed hawk is actually increasing, at least in the US and Canada. But certainly land use changes, especially urbanization and agriculture practice, have affected that species. If you have red-tailed hawks need trees, both for perch sites and nest sites, and they do need some isolation and not heavy population densities. But I should say that they also are well adapted. If anybody's been driving the Twin Cities area, for example, and seeing red-tailed hawks have become quite common in the clover leaves, there obviously must be some pretty good small mammal populations in those areas because they're fairly quite common. I can recall a statement by T.S. Roberts, who wrote this monumental book in 1932, and he talked about taking a trip down from the Twin Cities area to the southwestern Minnesota, and only seeing something in the order of 4 or 5 raptors during red-tailed hawks during that period. So they certainly are doing reasonably well compared to that period of time. Great horned owl crows on predation on eggs are an issue. Shooting still occurs, much less today. Trapping, wind farms, red-tailed hawks are the most frequently killed raptor in many of the large wind farms in California, and there's some electrocution. But no, it didn't seem to be affected much by DDT because they have a mammalian diet primarily. They're very poor catching birds, not fast enough. And also some pesticides in agriculture may be having an effect. And we also believe there's actually for that species, because of its wide distribution across the United States and Canada relative to other species, it should have minimal climate change impact. So golden eagle is another one that we count rather well at Hawk Ridge. Again, that this has shown also a large significant population increase from the Hawk Ridge data. Now, this is not the species that nests in Minnesota, but the question might be, so why the increase in golden eagles? Now, one of the things, the golden eagle is much more common in the Western United States and the Western regions and mountainous regions, but also there is an Eastern North American population east of Hudson Bay. And there's at least the birds, one of the most, I should say the birds of the world is one of the most, it's most authoritative documents available for all species of birds that occur in North America. And it's recently been expanded to birds of the world. So Unfortunately, it costs money you have to be either a member of an ornithological society or something to belong to that organization, or it costs money to subscribe to it. So a lot of people don't get a chance to see it, but they talk about an increasing population in that eastern population, which could be at least some of the birds that we count here. But there's certainly the species counted in at Hawk Mountain and on the eastern area are from that eastern population. There has been, again, reduction in human persecution via shooting, trapping, poisoning, education, and some of the legal action that has taken place has helped that. Lower levels of DDT also have certainly a factor in that increase. There's also some comments about increased overwinter survival with deer carcass, as it is with bald eagles, as we know, using deer carcasses. There are some, of course, some problems potentially with lead poisoning, but also there's a mention of actually predation on wild turkeys, potentially by golden eagles as well. Remember, though, the golden eagle is a whole Arctic species, so has populations in Eurasia. Some concern with vehicle collisions, power lines, and wind turbines, as there is of some of the other species as well. Move on to the rough-legged hawk. Another species like the golden eagle. It does not nest in the state of Minnesota. These data show that the species is declining. I put a question mark on that. It's almost significant, but it's significant since 2009, that decline in counts at Hawk Ridge. But it's also a complicated one because I'll go into those counts, why we think it might be declining. Well, first of all, actually the counts at Hawk Ridge are very important because we have very poor data on rough-legged hawks because they're nesting up in the tundra, across Canada, across Eurasia. And so counting rough-legged hawks is a very difficult task during the breeding season. So accurate counts are really lacking during that period of time. Again, whole Arctic species. Christmas bird counts indicate about 50,000 individuals overwinter south of Alaska and Canada, and more in the Western United States. So it is more of more of a Western species. The data suggests it's 3 to 4 year population cycle in that population. And when we observe that in our Hawk Ridge data, major mortality appear to be potentially roadkills, again, shooting and simply dying shortage of food in that species. So again, it's a very difficult species to study. We don't know that much about it because the large population breeding in Canada and in the northern regions. But it also, the reason I put a question mark in there about whether it's really declining or not is that it could be this, I'll talk a little more with several species about short stopping. Climate effects, if the climate is getting warmer in north of us in Canada, there's potentially a reason not to come as far south. And they've coined that migratory short stopping that was first coined dealing with sharp-shinned hawks in the east when they noticed that they had declined. So this is going to come up with other species. Are they not coming as far down? Are the food sources reasonable still far north? But it's still a very open question. And again, this is primarily a mammalian feeder, so it's not as affected with DDT as some of the other species that feed on birds and or aquatic organisms. This is the northern goshawk, one of our prime species at Hawk Ridge. Again, 1991 to 2019, this species is showing massive declines in migration counts. We had usually on the 9 to 10 year cycle, some really big numbers of goshawks migrating at Hawk Ridge. They're shown in a couple of diagrams, those dots way in the top, very large numbers. But you see from these from 2005 onward, those cycles have not occurred in the counts at Hawk Ridge. And so there's a massive decline in that species compared with the past. So why is that declining? Again, this is a very wide-ranging species. It occurs in North America and across Eurasia and Europe and across the continent of Asia. So it's very widely distributed. Again, like the rough-legged hawk, population and trends are poorly monitored. The vast majority of the population occurs farther north of Minnesota. So, and the breeding populations are very difficult to monitor. Again, trends have been cyclic, 10-year intervals. And there's a potential link with those 10-year cycles with the snowshoe hare growth cycles. Many of you have probably heard about the cycles of Canada lynx, very similar kinds of issues and some very big changes that occur in the population cycles of some of those prey organisms. Again, is this a situation of climate change, migratory short stopping, conditions being suitable, food sources being reasonable to have them stay farther north, and so not the need to fly south, or is in fact are the populations declining in those regions as well? We don't know the answer to that question. There have been a variety of studies in the United States looking at forest management related issues, and they do suggest that the sensitivity of the species to forest management, clear cutting especially, because of the need the species has for large tracts of mature forests for its nesting areas. And other factors include shooting, predation by great horned owls, starvation, etc., that also affect that people. Shooting seems to have declined, but it's still unclear, especially in some of the remote areas, how frequent that might still be. Okay, now we move a little closer to the 50 years we had. I'll go to the early migrating species, the species that are more or less may not totally be done, but are more or less done with their major migration period by the time we get into November. And so these results, and we'll go from 1974 to 2019. Again, I explained previously why those periods of time. So we first go to the peregrine falcon, another one species that has shown a tremendous increase and a highly significant increase over time back since 1974. So you see very few, again, cited back in that period in their 70s and early 80s, and a really nice increase in the population over time. Another huge success story, partly due to, certainly that species was affected by DDT. They feed a lot on of course, on birds, on smaller birds, and birds tend to accumulate DDT and some of the organophosphates because they feed on insects, so it bioaccumulates more as well. So that banning has helped the population reduce the problem with eggshell thinning. And we have to admire the very successful recovery and reintroduction programs that took place, a very strong coordinated effort to recover that population over time. I showed the nesting locations from the Birdie Atlas on the right-hand side. These are, of course, all the nesting locations, so they're confirmed sites. I put a quote in here from Jackie Fallon, 48 sites in Minnesota occupied during that Birdie Atlas period. with 122 fledglings at 46 of the territories. So, so the numbers look very good for the peregrine falcon and that recovery program in the state of Minnesota. Probably recovering back to something that existed back in prior to the DDT period. Protection of nest sites is also important. Education to avoid illegal shooting and the safe use of pesticides are certainly some of the bigger factors involved in that. So now we get to one species that is American kestrel, which is probably the most negative story we have about raptors today. In fact, just a couple of days ago, I just got a big publication from the Journal of Raptor Research that's completely focused on the American kestrel and the concern over this species. But interesting enough, the data from Hawk Ridge from over that period, even though you can clearly see lower populations and an increase between that 1990 2010 period, and then recently from the 2009 to 2019, there's been a significant decline of that species. So partly one of the issues is we're monitoring the American kestrel that exists is migrating south from areas north of here, rather than the populations that exist throughout the United States. But so what are the major issues going on with them? I have to say it is a very well monitored species. The breeding bird survey, that's the BBS, supports a very steep decline in that species, both in Minnesota, in the United States, and survey-wide, the combination of US and Canada. One of the big culprits is the changes in agricultural practices. Like the red-tailed hawk, they need nest trees, they need hunting perches, and use of pesticides has certainly reduced the available food sources for that species. They forage on large insects and small animals, both birds and small mammals. They have been negatively affected by the European starlings, and there's some concern with predation by Cooper's hawks. At Hawk Ridge, we had a talk about Cooper's hawks a number of years ago, probably about 15 years ago, by a guy named Brian Millsap, who studied Cooper's hawks, and he showed very clear pictures of Cooper hawks grabbing hold of a nest box and preying on European the American kestrels, young in a nest box. It's really quite a behavior by Cooper's hawks. Climate change, again, like the red-tailed hawk, we think there's minimal effects because it's really widely distributed over the North American continent. So relative, again, to other species, it would be not as affected. But it certainly was affected partly by DDT as well. So I showed one extra picture of the American kestrel, the breeding bird survey data on the left, clearly showing for the US and Canada from 1966 to 2019, massive declines, very tight confidence intervals on that trend as well, showing that decline. And I put the map up because one thing they've done is they've shown the Tuxent Laboratory in Laurel, Maryland has done an excellent job of analyzing the data, and they show with the mapping on the right, those places shown in red here are showing percent changes of less than 1.5%, which is very massive changes in the population based on that time period. You do see some blue in there. That's where the species actually increasing, kind of the mid-continent, mid-USA in that area, but really dominated by places where that species is declining. It looks like the Merlin, another nice success story, or with a significant increase in that population over time. They're showing from, again, 1974 to 2019, more gradual decline or increase, I'm sorry, from 1970s into the 1995 or so, and started tapering off, but then seemed like a bit of an increase here in the later period of time. But again, a very significant increase in that population over time. So why have they been increasing? Anything you read about the Merlin from the late 1800s, early 1900s by, for example, I.T.S. Roberts and others, they called the species nothing more than, they called it a migrant. It was not nesting in the state at that point in time. Oh, I should back up to say that Roberts, the only place that he had was had reports of the species nesting as of the early 1930s was a report of some Merlins nesting up on Lake Saginaga, up the Gunflint Trail. And I think they were all in Canada at that point in time. So he had never recorded a breeding Merlin in the state of Minnesota. So this is a relatively recent increase and primarily occurred from the beginning of the 1960s to the 2000s. And the species have been expanding south into urbanized areas by reusing old nests, especially old crow nests in particular. So they're not much of a nest builder. Obviously, they use other species, especially some of the larger species, for nesting sites. And they've really increased. This is on the left-hand side is a map of the Minnesota Breeding Bird Atlas, again showing how that species has really increased all the way down into the Twin Cities areas and into southeastern Minnesota as well, and a substantial spread across the northern portions of the state. And I think another factor coming into play is the food sources available in towns, house sparrows and other small birds. So they primarily forage on those particular species. Well, another increase, the turkey vulture. Again, most of you, if you're bird watchers, et cetera, you see a lot more turkey vultures today than you did back in the 70s or 80s or 90s even. That species has tremendously increased, highly significant increase in the population that have been counted at Hawk Ridge and across the country. So again, why have they increased? Again, expanding throughout North America. The banning of DDT was an important one for them because they were feeding on a lot of organisms that had DDT in them. And the shooting also, there was a lot of indiscriminate shooting in the early 1900s and certainly into the 1800s and even previously during that period. But the increased availability of food on the large number of roads that exist today compared to the early 1900s, and a lot more carrion. Deer populations have increased, a lot more carrion available for food for that species. Again, on the right is a picture from the Breeding Bird Atlas. The blue dots are the confirmed sites, and then there's shown in green are all lots of observed, where the species was observed, because you mostly see these birds flying around in the air rather than being able to find nests is quite a challenging task. And I point out, this is a very beneficial species, does a lot of cleaning up of some of the things that we leave, especially on roadsides. So very beneficial species. Sharp-shinned hawk. Again, from 74 to 2019. This looks like a declining trend, but it is insignificant, that trend from the period of 74 to 2019. Some of that mostly this is due to the high variability in some of the counts that have occurred over time. The recent trend from the 2009-2019 period is nearly significant, but it certainly indicates looking like there is a decline in the species. But it's probably, we think it might be a little more complicated than that. So what is the status of the sharp-shinned hawk? Population and trends are difficult to monitor for the species. It's highly variable accounts, even the monitoring, and it's very, very difficult to to do breeding counts of this species. It's a very secretive breeding species. I remember I wrote the account on this species, and I remember reading about it that said, it was something that said that if anybody thinks that it's unreasonable that we haven't been able to find as many nests, then they need to go out and try to find a nest of the sharp-shinned hawk. They're a very secretive species during the breeding season, and they occur in forested areas primarily. You'll see very few blue marks on this for confirmed nests in the breeding bird atlas shown on the right. I see a little one by this west of Mille Lacs Lake and a few there, but not many nests of this species were found. So it's really a challenging task. Again, the sharp-shinned hawk was the first one ever mentioned about this whole migratory short stopping. And it was, as mentioned by the observations in the east, where they are seeing declining trends of the species. So is it a population decline, or is it simply that species are not migrating in the numbers in previous years because of the warming climate that we see in North America? Again, this is a small bird. There is some concern with mercury. One of our students, Ted Kyle, analyzed some of the mercury data for the species and determined that there's potentially could be an effect of mercury on that species and the potential past effects of DDT. Other mortality factors, we still shooting, collisions with vehicles and windows, and predation by other raptors. Then we go to the Cooper's hawk. There's a very interesting trend. Again, overall from over that whole period of 74 to 2019 it was not an increase. It's not a significant increase, but certainly has an increase from 1974 to the mid 1995 period of time. And then there's been sort of a, should we say, almost a little bit of decline, or at least a stable population of that species. But it is, I would be the first one to admit that looks like it certainly should be determined as increased, but I think it also has to do with the numbers and the variability in some of those numbers, just say, because you have some low numbers here after year 2000 as well. Status of the Cooper hawk. I would say that most of the data, as you'll see a little later on the BBS, indicates a very strong population increase for that species across the US and United States. This species has had a high mortality due to illegal shooting. If you hear the word chicken hawk, it probably refers mostly to this species, potentially to the goshawk as well, or the other accipiter. That's big enough to take chickens. And the effects of DDT in the early mid-1900s, it certainly had an effect on this species as well. The map on the right shows the distribution of the current distribution in the state. See very wide distribution and nesting pretty far north in some parts of Minnesota. There has been a widespread population recovery of the species since the 1970s. And one of the benefits the species has been able to colonize urbanized areas and very strong use of urbanized areas today compared with the past. Just to point out that this species was in trouble prior to the 1970s. And in that period of time, was formerly extirpated, endangered, threatened, or a special concern in at least 16 eastern United States during that period of time. So in the past, there was a lot of concerns for this species. It does suffer from nest predation by a variety of critters, including raccoons, owls, great horned owl, at least northern goshawk, and red-tailed hawks. And I should note, this is one of the more difficult species to identify. Has similarities to the sharp-shinned hawk and to the goshawk, two of the other accipiters. And so one must be also cautious about identifying the species. So osprey has actually quite an interesting pattern from the accounts at Hawk Ridge. I think we've all known that that species has been increasing in a very strong pattern from, again, 1974 to about 1996, 1997, something like that. And then now it's sort of tapering off, even showing, shall we say, a slight decline in our counts at Hawk Ridge. So again, the osprey being a fish-eating bird had major effects of DDT on the population during the use of DDT, and the population has declined substantially, as shown by the low counts in the early 1970 period at Hawk Ridge. However, there's some speculation that the current populations maybe it's the highest in at least 100 years in the United States, because of the recovery and all the other factors that affected that population in the previous periods of time. Management has been very effective: water protection, nest sites, reintroductions of that species. And I want to point out in the Birds of the World, which was written by a guy named Dick Biergaard, and he really points out the importance of the placement of nest structures for that species and for available nest sites. That was really an important part of the recovery of that species as well. Negatives, yeah, bald eagles and osprey don't necessarily get along. Bald eagles are pretty aggressive sometimes with osprey. In the past, and probably still currently, they're still shot. Ingestion of lead potentially is an issue with mercury and other chemicals, that being a fish-eating bird that might be exposed to many of those chemicals. And there's literally this species nests near water, and especially in coastal areas. So there's considerable uncertainty in that species with climate change. Northern harrier at Hawk Ridge, this shows an insignificant trend. So should we say, I guess it could be considered somewhat stable in the area. So what are some of the interesting aspects of that species? Population and trends of the species are difficult to monitor. Shown on right is the results of Breeding Bird Atlas. And again, not that many confirmed nests that were actually found, but the species is observed repeatedly in many locations, and you see very widely distributed across the state of Minnesota. Again, this species was considered to be in at least the 60s and 70s was potentially in trouble, primarily because it had been decline, especially with the loss of wetlands, that it uses big open wetlands for nesting and foraging. Increases in intensive agriculture. It does occur in large fields, and as they're intensively cultivated, they have declined in use. And DDT also implicated in some of the declines. Trends now seem to be stable, but with considerable uncertainty. And as pointed out by Dave Schimm from the Department of Biology and a participant in the Hawk Ridge Research Committee, he wrote a very nice paper on the 4-year cycle on interior populations, that is populations such as in Minnesota that have seem to be on a 4-year cycle during their migration period. Causes are very complex, difficult sometimes to decipher. I think this is the last one, or the broadwing hawk, the hawk that we count the most of at Hawk Ridge. showing no overall trend in results. But again, I would point out this high variability makes it very difficult to identify a trend in that species over that period of time. So I guess the best thing we could probably say it is a stable population. Again, very widely distributed species in the state of Minnesota, shown here. Actually, a lot of intensive activity down in the Twin City area. They did a good job of both finding nests and finding birds in those areas, but it certainly is one of the dominant species in the forest. I'm reading through a lot of the historical accounts of the species. I was really, I knew that this was going on, but it's a lot of really grisly tales of slaughter of this species that occurred during migration periods in the late 1800s or early 1900s. I mean, literally hundreds and hundreds of these birds were being shot during migration period when they're kettling and then moving southward. Historic loss of forests has really affected the overall population. And certainly, as Roberts points out, this species was nesting farther south in the state of Minnesota, but lots of those forested areas have certainly been lost and are heavily fragmented. There is some evidence that the species seems to be expanding a bit in the west, to the west of Minnesota, and is still by far the most common forest raptor in the state of Minnesota today. And the DDT did not seem to affect this one. Again, this seems the species mostly feeds on mammals, and amphibians are the primary parts of its diet. I'll take a quick look at my watch here. So I'm getting close to wrapping it up, but I thought I would take a stab at trying to put it all into one little diagram to say, what does this all mean? And I think the one thing I want to point out about the raptors, they're doing actually quite well. And certainly I think part of this is due to the banning of DDT in 1972. But not just that, there's been a lot of really positive things going on. So if we look at it, I tried to look at both the data from Hawk Ridge and the North American Breeding Bird Survey. Breeding Bird Survey is done by thousands of volunteer counters in a big systematic count done across the whole United States and Canada. And so what I've got here is HR stands for Hawk Ridge, and a plus means that the population, there's a positive population increase. And the BBS also showing the same thing. So for the increasing species, species is increasing and very consistent in both databases, except for the peregrine falcon, which is showing an unclear signal from the Breeding Bird Survey. Basically, the Breeding Bird Survey is not a very good technique for determining the population trend or populations of peregrine falcons. But basically, all the other ones are consistent for those 5 species or 4 species. We look at this both data sets for the BBS, sharp-shinned hawks, we showed as being stable. That is indicated by 0. The BBS data showing a question mark, and they do not monitor this sharp-shinned very well. So we call it stable, or I will call it stable. These are my results in a summary. Uncertain, well, osprey, I put 3 here that are potentially not uncertain. Osprey is increasing the BBS and they're monitored reasonably well. We found that they're stable in our counts. Same with the broad-winged hawk, but they're also showing an increase in the Breeding Bird Survey. Red-tailed hawk also showing an increase in the Breeding Bird Survey. I think both the red-tailed and broad-wing and osprey are all probably monitored well on a national scale, and their populations seem to be increasing. The golden eagle, Hawk Ridge shows an increase. breeding bird survey shows a stable population, primarily data from the western portion, because the eastern population of golden eagles doesn't occur here during the breeding season. Northern Harrier, I continue to call it uncertain. They have the breeding bird survey shows that a survey wide in the US and Canada has a decline. And I put a real gray area for in rough-legged hog in gray. It's decreasing in the hawk ridge counts. Breeding bird survey is not useful at all for determining that rough-legged hawk. The counts, there are not enough counts up in Canada to work on and data from trends and populations from that area. And the two species on the decline, which I suppose is good news given that most of the species seem to be doing or increasing, they're stable or at least uncertain on the situations. The American kestrel, definitely, I put in lowercase, the hawk ridge data says it's stable, but the BBS data very resounding negative trend for that particular species. Goshawk, also hawk ridge data show negative. Breeding bird survey is not useful for determining the status of the goshawk. But it certainly looks like, based on counts across much of the United States, that the migration counts show a decline in that species. So positive long-term trends for 8 of 14 raptor species and stable for 1 species. I guess we'd say a nice result, a positive result. Negative long-term trends probably for 2 of the 14 species. Considerable uncertainty to estimate a trend for 3 species because of conflicting data. So my big summary, raptor migration sites at hawk ridge appear to provide useful data for species like the bald eagle and merlin, plus species with northerly distributions like the northern goshawk, golden eagle, and rough-legged hawk. all of these species are difficult to monitor during the breeding season. So migration counts are really very important. And it's good to see that there's a lot of consistency between the counts we get at hawk ridge and those counts done at a national level. I complete with one, I happened to find this one little cartoon that says, well, I used to fly south. That was before hot tubs, but maybe it's just a symbol of, or analogy with the short stopping many of these birds. Climate change has changed things a bit, so they don't have to, they used to fly south, but they don't anymore. But we don't know the answer to that question. Okay, so Margie, should I turn back over to you to monitor something, or how do you want to handle this?
Sure. Well, let's open it up for questions from anybody. Don't have anything much in the chat, except Julie Brown did put a chat comment that they're working on the new RPI analysis currently, and that'll be analyzing data through fall of 2022. Hopefully it'll be available this fall. It says probably. So that's good news from Humana. But otherwise, chat-wise, we didn't have any questions. So we will let you open your mics and show your faces if you want, and ask any questions that you might have. Crickets. We got crickets. Jerry, we got crickets.
Oh, hello. Good evening, everyone. I'll ask a question.
Hi, Daniel.
Hi, Margie. Good to see you again.
Yeah.
Well, I really enjoyed this talk. I think it was lovely the way you laid out all the population trends for each species. Really showed, you know, the trends that we who worked at Hawk Ridge, like myself, really stressed to the public to describe the mixed bag for different species. I'm curious, are you seeing for certain species like, say, the Swainson's hawk, enough numbers to be able to make an accurate assessment for those species, or are they just too rarely seen at Hawk Ridge for that?
Yeah, that species is, the counts are just not large enough to have, have any confidence in determining a trend for that species in there. It's a very Western species. It does occur in Minnesota. And so again, if you look at the Breeding Bird Atlas, that website, we do use one of the counts from the Breeding Bird Survey from one of the bird conservation regions for the best that we found would be the best one for determining a trend in that species. And I don't recall if it's positive or negative or what, but yeah, it's too rare to use, and we just get enough of them to count to make any kind of trend estimate for that species.
All right. Well, thank you.
Yeah. They don't occur north of here. That's what that problem is.
We have a question from Alan, or have we used eBird data in our analysis or in your analysis?
The answer is no. eBird is still relatively young in some ways. But no, we haven't done that. I think it's going to be a challenge because we have a lot of different observers and a lot of different qualities and things of that sort. But I'm looking forward to it. It's a fantastic program. There's no question about it. And I participated in it. So, but I have not seen anything yet using eBird for that, for population or trend information. But it's coming, I'm sure. It's maybe the analogy I have right now is with Christmas bird count data is also kind of in that area that's, it's not very consistent at any one place. Some place you have, 100 observers at one Christmas bird count, and another place you might have 3. And so that's really a big factor, is the amount of effort that goes into some of these databases, that there's really different. It's hard to reconcile those observation sites.
True. Other questions, other thoughts?
Just a question about citizen science, which eBird is, and the Christmas count, I think, is too. Do you think citizen science technology projects like that are helpful, useful in creating useful data, I guess?
My opinion, absolutely. It's fantastic. I don't think they've explored enough. In fact, I would love to get into the Christmas bird count data in more detail. And there have been some analyses of that. I think if you go to eBird, Christmas bird count data, this new Cornell's Feeder Watch program, I think there's some fantastic data that can be analyzed there. Okay. However, I'm a little bit old school. I'm from when we do our counts in the National Forest bird count, for example, we control things very, very stringently. Yeah. I test the people I hire if they can identify the birds. I test their hearing, that they make sure that they can hear adequately. And then we do standardization of everybody going out together to make sure we're gathering it the same way. And then we let them go, then people go out and gather the data itself. And it's only a 10-minute period of time. And I think so we really try to reduce the biases, if you will, as much as possible. But I think those are some real valuable databases in the future, those things, especially we know very little about winter birds, for example, and that Feeder Watch program, I think could be quite interesting.
Just one other quick comment about eBird. When I've mentioned to friends who are not birders that I'm using eBird and what it is, I get met often with skepticism. Like, okay, just citizens are submitting observations. Really, how accurate is that? So this is from, non-scientific, non-birder type people.
Yeah, but personally, I don't know. I know that they've got filters built in.
Yeah.
I don't know how they do it, but I suspect that there's going to be a lot of filtering that goes into some of the data, and I think the RPI have done the same thing to some extent, and I know BBS does it to some extent, and that doesn't mean they can publicize everything they're doing. They probably should, but ultimately it comes out, but it gets on to personal issues and that sort of thing. So I don't know. I agree with you. There's some skepticism, but I think there's some bright people looking at the data.
Great, thank you.
We have another question. Carolyn
I see
Hoffman.
Carolyn Hoffman here. Hi Carolyn, it's a long time since I've seen you.
So the question is, what about winter raptor surveys? How might that factor into analysis?
Well, there's another one. I was trying to propose even for Hawk Ridge that we look at, and I think Frank Nicoletti may have done something like there is an approach that Humana has. Well, they've got a protocol for doing winter bird surveys. And it's really good, but it does take work, and you have to standardize as much as you possibly can. So it's on their website, a winter survey protocol for raptors. I know I'm very familiar with the country of Finland, and they have a very good survey like that, where they have a set area and the people going and searching very detailed, counting raptors and grouse, for example, in set areas with a very stringent, very strict protocol. So, but the Humana has a winter survey protocol available.
And I know that the Eagle Center has a yearly survey as well in January.
I hope they're using the one that, so if you have everybody using the same one, then it's much easier to analyze the data.
Yeah, I don't know what they're using. I keep saying I'm going to be part of that survey and I haven't done it yet.
Yes.
Anybody else? All righty. Well, Jerry, why don't you go ahead and stop your screen share and send the host back to me.
Before I do that, I want to thank everybody for coming, and hopefully you got something out of this. And unfortunately, I didn't hear the big applause I would normally get, but anyway.
Yeah.
Thanks for listening in.
Thank you. It was great.
Thank you.
Yes, thanks much. Let's see. Yeah, we're getting thanks. Comments that it was wonderful. Good stuff like that. I'm going to